So now we have our enemy in place. So what we want to do is have that enemy look at our player and advance towards our player in the game. So once the enemy advances towards the player, if it should come in contact, if it should collide, then the lose screen will appear. So this is what we're going to do, and this is kind of a long one, a drawn out process. So the first thing I'm going to do is move my enemy because I don't want it right there at my player when the game starts. I want to have a little bit of a challenge. So I'm just going to move it out of the way and make it hidden in the little grass over there. So in order for this iguana to move about, it has to move in what is called path finding. And in order to create this path finding, you need to create what is called NavMesh and NavMesh agents. And nav is just short for navigation. The NavMesh agent is the object that moves about, and the NavMesh itself is the area that the player will move about. And the NavMesh area is going to be the terrain. I have my terrain pretty much how I like it. There's a terrain, and then there are planks within my terrain, and those are nested with each other. So that's good. If you have not nested your terrain and your rocks and whatever else you have in your terrain, then you might want to nest it together by creating an empty object. For example, if you had logs or fallen trees, rocks, anything that is a prefab or an object that was added to your terrain, you will need to make all of this one component. So all of that would need to go in an empty object. So the first thing I want to do is create my NavMesh agent. So my NavMesh agent is done by by selecting the iguana, and then in the iguana I'm going to add component, navigation, NavMesh agent. Now this adds another little component, just like anything else that you would have added in your component area. It brings it up in the inspector window. And you need to make the sizes known. Now usually you could use your collider numbers right here to add to these NavMesh areas. So what we're doing is we're asking it to say, how far of a radius does the player need to be in this NavMesh? How high does the NavMesh need to be in order for this object to move about? Those kinds of things. So I've provided some numbers. If you're not using the same enemy, you're going to have to play with these numbers a little bit. Take a look at your collider and then, or even the size of your object, and that should help you with these numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and add these numbers as they're stated in the text, and I pretty much tell you about what the maximum velocity is and all of that stuff in there, so you can read that and decide for yourself how you want your player to move about and how quickly in units you want your player, but your enemy, to move about. I'll be right back after I add my numbers. Okay, so I've added my numbers here, and the enemy should move fairly quickly. The angular speed, how quick they're going to turn and how fast they accelerate, is how fast from a stopping point the enemy will move. You can change these numbers to have all kinds of different outcomes. So that's where we're at right now. So our NavMesh and our NavMesh agent has been created. So I'm going to File, Save Scene. Before we move on, we should also apply that to the prefab. So when I call that prefab, everything I've done to this particular iguana in the scene will be applied to the prefab in case I call upon that prefab to instantiate. Do you guys remember that word? Alright, so let's make our NavMesh area that the NavMesh agent moves about. So as I stated, I have my terrain parented. So if you need to create your empty object, go for it. So we have done that here. Now we need to create this by going to our window, navigation. And once our window navigation appears, we want to bake the navigation. So when we bake the navigation, it's almost like baking a cookie. We're going to bake it and it's going to happen. It's going in the oven. We're cooking them up. So here, these particular numbers are usually the same as your agent. So that's kind of important. So we had with our agent, if I go, well, I better just add them first. So for our radius, we had a 0.25, and our height, we had a 0.15, if I remember correctly. The slope and the height should be changed, depending upon your area. I don't have a lot of height here. I have a little bit here, but I think we're going to be good to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select Bake. And what happens is once it's baked, your NavMesh will show in your game. So if we select it, I'm hoping it's still exporting. I'm sorry. Takes a little while. So what this blue is showing me is everywhere that the nav agent can travel. So there are a few places that the poor little guy can't move about, but that's okay because later on I'll make it a little more challenging. But I don't like to see this blue when I'm working in my game, so I uncheck the Show NavMesh. That's just a simple little process. So you've now created your NavMesh agent and your NavMesh for the agent to move about, the Pathfinder. So now let's save everything and we'll go from there.